What's up, fucker? It's your boy, Quarantina Shevchenko, dancing on the grave of Tony versus Khabib. And it's the Fights Gone By podcast, episode 206. We've had some fights, and I feel like all that frustration, all that pent-up need to watch two men hit each other in the face has been released. But I did watch Michelle Waterson not punch a girl in the face, and that was quite frustrating. It was a pretty good card. I mean, the fights you expected to be bad were bad. The fights you expected to be good were good. And the good outweighed the bad for the most part, is what I'd say. And main event was banging. Co-main event was banging. It was all just, really good. And apparently they got like 700,000 pay-per-view buys, which is a lot for the modern era. Well, it's a lot even at the best of times. So, that's what we're doing. We're capitalizing on there not really being anything going on, getting all the views, and with respect to the UFC, that's a great plan. It's not, the most moral thing in the world to do, to start doing these, sporting events in the middle of a pandemic. And Jacare tested positive, and his two cornermen also tested positive. So some of these fighters will probably be testing positive in the coming weeks, but don't let that get you down too much. We are in rinky-tink shit show sport. It's not a real sport, and they're certainly not going to protect the fighters by giving them a union. The MMA, the NBA, NFL, they've all got players associations who are going to go to bat for them before they can go back to playing. But all of that aside, and just enjoying fights, it was fucking fun. Where should we start? Should we start at the top? Let's start with Tony Ferguson versus Justin Gaethje, because this is the one that we were all very excited for. I spent the entire, I was going to say 2 weeks up to this fight, but it was booked like twice. So the entire time I was saying that's a terrible, it's a terrible idea to risk your big payday, your biggest fight ever. You are one half of the biggest fight the UFC is ever going to put on, and you just risk it on a short notice replacement. Someone as dangerous as Justin Gaethje, and Gaethje looked magnificent here. I've been the Pope of the Church of Gaethje for a very long time, but I cannot believe he's the same guy that I was excited about coming into the UFC, because he has completely changed. There's still stuff that's the same, but the style, there's no more frantic pressure. He really just took Tony apart over, was it 4 rounds? Was it stopped in the fourth or fifth? He took him apart over 20 minutes, which is, not what we expect from Justin Gaethje. We expect him to grind you down very, very quickly by running face first at you. And he took on a guy with a legendary gas tank and outclassed him for the duration of the fight. I think, lots of people have said, like, Tony looked off, this, that, and the other. I don't want to put anything. I don't like focusing on excuses. I don't think doing 2 weight cuts back to back just to prove a point was a great idea, but Tony, his entire career has been bad ideas, and it's never gone wrong up till now. The deadlifts and mace spells on top of a Bosu ball or whatever it was, shit like that, kicking metal poles. So you can't really use the excuse of one bad decision when he's been making them constantly for ages. I think what it looked like to me was the first round started okay. He looked cautious, but where he normally really builds confidence through a fight, and you can see him starting to look more convincing. Because there's nothing better than, if you're sparring someone and you feel like you've got the read on them, and you feel like you know what they're going to do, and you can start going, up, down, show him a feint, do this, show him a feint, do that, building off different things, and you can put them in a completely defensive spot where they're just trying to keep up with you. And that's a lot of what Tony does. And he really didn't look like he ever got comfortable in this fight, and he got more uncomfortable throughout it, obviously. But, where he normally builds and adds so much stuff, and that's where we start talking about that unpredictability and all the weird shit he does. It's interesting because it gets into this idea of being a rounded fighter and having variety in your game. There's variety, a lot of variety in your game is going to be things that synergize and build off each other. And if you start taking away key parts of that, the other things don't work as well on their own. And where you would like to see Tony use, once he started getting clipped with the counter right hands and started worrying about the striking, you'd like to see him go to, maybe push him to the cage and use a cage wrestling style of game. But that would be that's something that doesn't really synergize with his game, and it's not something he can do on its own. It gets into the question of like, do you want to be well-rounded in that you can use all these tools and they all build off each other, or do you want to be well-rounded in the sense that you've got a couple of takedowns and some strikes and they don't really go together, but you can at least go, fuck it, flip the coin, change the game plan entirely. You've got two different modes, whereas I think Tony only has mixing everything together, and then if you start taking parts out of that, it really started to look like he was short on ideas, which we know he's very rarely short on ideas. Didn't get to the body kicks too much. I mean, he started the first round and he was landing good body kicks. I said in my pre-fight stuff that the low kicks have always been a problem for Tony Ferguson. If you watch the Michael Jordan, I've been watching The Last Dance. If you watch the Michael Johnson fight and the Eve Edwards fight and one of his late tough ones, he's just taking these low kicks and not really doing anything about them, outside low kicks especially. And Anthony Pettis hit him with a hard outside low kick on his injured leg right off the bat, and he changed stances and didn't look like back to normal for a few minutes into that fight. And of course he kept Pettis backing up that entire time, whereas Gaethje was kicking him and then he wasn't really pushing back effectively. Because that's a nice thing about fighting kickers is if you take some nasty low kicks and you put some pressure on them, back them up, keep them from standing, being able to stand on one leg and kick you, you can buy yourself some time to work that, work some blood back into that leg, get some movement back into it, and start feeling okay again. Like body shots or anything, actually, you can take some pressure off by being aggressive against the opponent. But Tony really couldn't get that going. And I think part of it's the power disparity. Tony's a respectable hitter in his own right. That's what he was known for when he came into the UFC, knocking dudes out with one or two good punches. And then he changed into this sort of pressure fighter, as we discussed in the Filthy Casuals Guide. But I think he definitely... Because I've watched him take punches from good people and he just gets over it. RDA's a decent hitter. Pettis can be a decent hitter but breaks his hands nowadays. Barbosa, obviously a decent hitter. But Gaethje was catching him clean, and you saw him... that short counter right hand was annoying him. The slapping left hook. They were raving about Justin's left hook. And I think that's something that I've really noticed in recent years, or like last year and a half, to be honest. The use of his left hook, I think it's there more because he's not always trying to push into the guy. It's there as a counter. He goes back onto his stance. He'll throw the right hand and then go back with the left hook. And I think that works better for him than trying to stay on top of the guy in left hook. He used to be very much like squared up in his stance and then try, like gloves up, and then try and right hook you in the head on the counter, like the Palomino fights. But his left hook's really become a useful weapon for him. And of course, with Tony Ferguson's low hands and high head, it was just slapping in against the side of his head and neck every time he stepped in. Tony Ferguson's chin, again, proved to be ridiculous. He was taking just insane shots from Justin Gaethje. But there's being able to take the shots, but clearly he was still feeling the shots and starting to worry about it because his output never really picked up again after like the second round. And the low kicks seemed to slow him down too. And I thought it was, you don't notice the low kicks as much when it's mixed in with all the other stuff that Gaethje was doing. You used to notice them because that was all he did. It was like absorb punches on the guard, low kick. And of course, the other thing about these low kicks, like, he used to do these amazing chopping down low kicks from almost on top of the opponent or even in the clinch. But now he's throwing them more like an orthodox fighter further out, he's doing it from an appropriate range. So he's maybe not like kicking one leg through the other, but he's not getting caught on one leg as much. In fact, he hasn't really been caught on one leg since like the Poirier fight, where he did get caught on one leg against Poirier, Alvarez, Johnson, and I think in one of those Palomino fights too. Dude looked really coachable, getting along well with Trevor Whitman, still looking like his own guy, but looking a bit more like Rose Namajunas when she really got it all together. It was head movement and bouncing footwork in there too. Just really lovely stuff. Those guys really, both him and Rose Namajunas, they can use the jab, but they don't really do it a lot. They do a lot of right hand leads and stepping in with left hooks. But I've always said that Justin Gaethje, if he learned the jab, could be really dangerous. And I've seen him hurt guys with the jab in the past, in like the 3 or 4 times he's thrown it, a bit like Cody Garbrandt. But in this one, his jab looked great. He didn't throw it enough. I'm never going to say he threw his jab enough, but he didn't start throwing it until like round 3. But every time he hit him, like, it was quicker than his usual punches, but it seemed to catch Tony it was like Tony could see the other ones coming and absorb them a bit better. But because it was a jab, and it's also a jab coming from just a monstrous hitter, it was really shaking him up. And I think the stoppage was, he got caught with a jab and then he shook his head. And I was astonished the number of people who've never seen that before. Like, that happens all the time in boxing and kickboxing and MMA. Dudes shaking their heads to try and, they call it shaking out the cobwebs or whatever. But shaking your heads, blinking is another one that's quite common. It's just trying to get your equilibrium back. But I've seen people go like, that was him quitting in that moment. And I've seen people who were like, oh my God, I was scared when his neck went into spasm. And you're like, when did his neck go into spasm? I think it's the sad thing about this fight, and the thing that we all really saw coming if Tony lost this one. We were all like, well, they're completely different fighters. Tony losing here doesn't tell us anything about how that match with Khabib would have gone. And Justin beating Tony after beating the last 3 guys he beat also doesn't tell us anything about what he can do against a guy who's like diving for his hips constantly. So we're still sort of in the dark. I mean, Khabib versus Justin is an awesome fight, and I'm definitely not going to say no to it. I think I wouldn't be so worried about this stuff, or like worried about people getting gypped out of their title shots and missing out on things if Khabib didn't fight like once a year. But, we'll see. Shout out to the absolutely baller low kick that Ferguson, I think, opened the 4th round with or something like that. He, put a hand to the mat, swept across with like either capoeira or silat. It's probably a kick in both, but took out Justin Gaethje's lead leg. And Justin was on his hands and knees for a second, but Tony sort of came up and just stared at him like, oh, I didn't expect that to actually work. But that was really cool. Tony does a lot of that stuff, putting his hands to the ground and sliding towards the opponent with like a little butt scoot thing. It was cool to see him actually do something out of it. But I think really, there's been criticism of like Eddie Bravo's cornering, which was, in addition to being garbage, he didn't wear his mask the entire time. But, saying things like go for the Imanari roll. If you watch like Ryan Hall, and I say watch Ryan Hall because he's basically the only guy doing it, but Ryan Hall has clever setups for his Imanari rolls. They fit in with his game. If you watch I don't know what he calls it. I watched his amazing new 50-50 instructional a little while ago, but I can't remember, the roll into the backside 50-50, the opposite direction Imanari roll where the head goes between the legs. He set that up by throwing a low kick and stepping out the side, throwing a low kick from southpaw stance and putting his leg back behind him into orthodox stance so that he was set up to roll in the direction he needed to. It all flowed together and he'd clearly worked on that. Whereas when you watch Tony do Imanari rolls, they are literally just, he sort of takes a run up at the guy. And it was, he did it like 4 times against Edson Barbosa. And it's a very cool move. It's just that obviously Ryan Hall has a lot more success with it because he actually implemented it into his striking, and it's not just him going out there going, I'm a jiu-jitsu guy and I'm desperately rolling at your legs. And I don't think that I haven't seen too many takes of like, what's Tony Ferguson going to do trying to wrestle Justin Gaethje? He's a D1 whatever ever. And I know that Tony is also D1 something or other, but I don't give a shit about what these divisions are. I'm English. Was he Eton or Harrow? That's all that matters. But guys who don't have that level of wrestling credentials in their background have used wrestling effectively against Justin Gaethje. Now, granted, that was before this little streak he's on, but I don't remember anyone really trying to wrestle him on this little streak. Both Dustin Poirier and Eddie Alvarez ducked in on takedowns and either took him off his feet or made him throw them off. And he got tired from doing that. So I don't, if you had Tony working with a proper coach, if you had Tony working with a more standard coach and a more standard camp, there's no reason that he couldn't have used his wrestling to make life harder for Justin Gaethje. But that isn't who Tony is. And I'm not going to, sit here and say, oh, we need to get Tony to Jackson Wink. That was the one everyone said back in the day. I want to see him throwing oblique kicks and running around the cage and point sparring. That was the thing. You've had a couple of bad fights, get down Jackson Wink and adopt the same kickboxing style as everyone else. No, like, live by the sword, die by the sword. I think it's awesome the way that he's made his own game. And, flaws in his own game cost him that fight, or rather an inability to change his own game cost him that fight. And it's the same with Dominic Cruz. Dominic Cruz, every time, well, both the times he loses, dudes are like, well, it was basic boxing that beat him. It was his rubbish boxing that cost him. And you're like, a little bit more complex than that. And he's had incredible success for a good reason. It's not that he's just competing against dumbasses and shitlords. But let's talk co-main event. I won't talk too much about the co-main event because I wrote something for the Patreon boys yesterday because I watched it and I just got so excited. I was like, that is a really good performance because I've recently done a big study for the Patreon boys called Absolute Masterclass Garbrandt versus Cruz, where we talked about how Garbrandt took steps back, drew Cruz in. Cruz likes to slide down the side with the safety lead, sort of jab down the left side or step down your right side. Step down the right side of his opponent while in a southpaw stance, and likes to take those little angles. And if you step back, he's coming through the front of your guard again and not down the side. And he's got the choice to either stop the attack or just run through the center of your guard, and then you're in a tit-for-tat exchange, which is not what he wants. So Garbrandt did a great job of taking away angles, and then when Cruz was overstepping and expecting him to keep retreating, Cruz would run in and he'd suddenly get caught with counter punches. So there was a bit of that in this Cejudo versus Cruz fight, but more than that, it was pressure fighting worked really well for Cejudo here. I thought his performance was marvellous. He kicked the legs, backed him towards the fence, and this is something that I saw in the first Demetrius Johnson Cejudo fight. I was like, damn, if he does that, he's going to do really well, because he backed him up. Demetrius Johnson started circling out, feet level, so sidestepping rather than in a stance, and he punted the trailing leg, the right leg. And I thought, fuck, if he does that for the whole fight, and then he never did it again. And then he didn't do it any time in the second fight either. But in this fight, he seemed very aware that that's a great way to get off on a guy who uses a lot of lateral movement. If you use a lot of lateral movement, you're not normally doing it from your stance. If you look at the really good guys who do it all the time, who are constantly moving laterally, you're leaving your stance so that your feet are level, so that you can sidestep more. If your feet are staggered, you've got advantages going forward and back, and you're in a stance, and you can duck and do things like that. But if you bring your feet level, you can sidestep much quicker and more effectively, which you'll see Dominic Cruz, Demetrius Johnson do whenever they're moving around their opponent, but you'll also see them especially do it when they get to the fence. They collapse the stance and they step out either one side or the other, normally fake one way, go the other. Just perfect defensive ring craft. And the thing that everyone obsesses or gets obsessed with when they get Dominic Cruz to the fence is his head. They're like, oh, here's my chance. And he invites them. He's like, my hands are down. Oh, no, I'm against the fence. Please don't hit me in the head. Please don't throw me in the briar patch. And everyone swings at his head, and his head moves. The body doesn't move, which is how Willie Pep got beaten by, Sandy Sadler. He kept ducking under Sadler's left hook, so Sadler just dug it to the body and groin because it was Sadler. But the one in MMA and kickboxing that you should be doing, and it's not particularly common to see this sort of movement in kickboxing, so the one you should be doing in MMA is kicking the trailing leg. The legs are always on a track at that point. You can't duck with your legs, and it's very hard to lift your legs over something when you're sidestepping too. And Cejudo was doing that beautifully. He was also, after his very first kick, he targeted exclusively Cruz's right leg, because Cruz constantly goes left foot forward, left foot back, left foot forward, left foot back, and every time he retreats, he goes back onto a southpaw stance, a very short southpaw stance that I call the launch pad in that Garbrandt article. So he'd fake and step in, and Cruz would rebound into that southpaw stance, and he'd punt him in the right leg. Worked wonderfully. And then the fight ending moment came when he moved Cruz towards the fence, and Cruz, through the uppercut, tried to weave out the side door. A Willie Pep favourite. I pointed this out before the fight, and I pointed it out in my post-fight piece, and then I watched the interview with him today, and he actually said it out loud. He was like, when I throw the uppercut, they normally throw the hook, and I duck out the side door. He didn't throw the hook, he threw the knee, and that was something that Cejudo had obviously seen several times before in that fight already. There was a beautiful southpaw right uppercut and duck out the side door that Cruz did. But if you move him to the fence, and you cut off his retreat, he's going to sidestep, and he's going to weave his head, because those are the things that he can do from there. You cut off some of the options, you know what the other ones are, so you can sort of play to them. And he caught him with a beautiful knee in the head. He'd been looking for knees in the head proactively before that. He grabbed a single, went up to a body lock, and then when Cruz threw his hips back, he tried to knee him in the head. He also tried to do it when Cruz grabbed his leg, because that's how Cruz dissuades people from kicking him in the leg. Cejudo's sprawl was awesome in this fight. I said I wasn't going to talk about this much, but I have just rambled on about it. Sorry. But yeah, if you want to hear more about that fight, go read the Patreon piece, because I summed it all up, and I put in diagrams and stills and things to show you what I'm talking about. I thought it was a marvellous performance from Henry Cejudo, and as I, just talking through the whole article now, but I basically said, I have no idea how to rate Cejudo because, he's managed to duck the top bantamweights to take this fight. He never got the third match with Demetrius Johnson, which is Demetrius Johnson's fault. That's not Cejudo's fault. I think in the rubber match, especially now, I think Cejudo would murder him. But he never got the chance to have that rubber match, and Demetrius Johnson didn't take the chance to have that rubber match. So we don't really know. And then even the TJ Dillashaw fight is a little bit odd because DJ Dillashaw decided to prove a point by cutting an extra 10 pounds and going down to flyweight. So Cejudo's career has been very strange, especially as a bantamweight. But you can't argue that it's bad. I mean, he's really fucking good, and you can see he's just getting better and better. So if he does retire, I have no idea what to make of him. But it's been brilliant watching him because he used to be so fucking boring to watch, and then he found karate. And what's his name? Manto something or other. Manto Santana is his karate coach. Works with Pitbull as well. Pitbull, the good one. But yeah, he's done marvellous things just recreating himself as a karate boxer. It might be time to do that Karate Boxer's Filthy Casual Guide now. God, imagine him versus Koji. Just all the karate boxing. Anyway, sorry, rest of the card we've got to talk about. And I wanted to talk about the upcoming card. So what was good on this? I mean, Francis Ngannou bum-rushed Rosenstruck and knocked him out with the flailing Todd Duffy punch. He threw like a right downward hammer fist and then a Todd Duffy left hook from behind him and caught him. And it was because he threw about 10 punches in a row. And at some point in that exchange, Rosenstruck was like, yeah, it won't keep coming now. That'd be silly. Oh, unconscious. Yeah, I mean, as much as the bum rush, if you bum rush all the time, you are what you eat. You are a bum, but there is nothing. Just the value at the bum rush is in catching people early, And Roy Jones used to do this. It was like if he, you get a lot of, these two are circling each other for 2 rounds. There's a lot of respect being shown. Roy Jones always said this, and this has always been my thinking too. Like if you really respect someone, try and cold cock them. Just try and knock them out off the bat. Because if you can like Jose Aldo, Cub Swanson, 5-second knockout, no matter what that other person does, everyone's just going to go, we don't really need to see the rematch. I mean, the guy knocked him out in 5 seconds, even though 5 seconds tells you nothing about the actual matchup. So yeah, Ngannou versus Rosenstruck, we're going to be very hard to sell a rematch of that, even if Rosenstruck keeps winning things and Ngannou keeps winning things. I mean, at the moment, we're just sort of waiting to coronate Ngannou because, like, the UFC hates Stipe. Company man Daniel Cormier. I love Daniel Cormier, but he is a serious bootlicker. He's out there calling for the rematch with Stipe. I forget which one's champion because it was such a bad fight last time. I mean, it was good fighting like it was a slobber knocker, but it just showed how bad heavyweights are generally. I mean, who else you got? Like Volkov? Speaking of Volkov, Greg Hardy versus Jorgen De Castro. I said this would be bad. It was bad. There you go. 2 fat boys throwing kicks at each other. I mean, Greg Hardy's not particularly fat. He's gigantic and roidy, but just throwing low kicks at each other and having a bad kickboxing match. Calvin Kattar versus Jeremy Stephens went down exactly like it could only go down 2 ways. They would fight exactly the same fights that they always fight, but either Stephens was going to knock him out or Kattar would make him look like a fool. And it was Stephens throwing low kicks and swinging straight arm lariats, and Kattar shooting 1-2s and stepping offline, and also eating too many low kicks because he always does. But caught him with a couple of right hands, leaning back. Kattar does this where it happened against Burgos too, where he just convinces dudes he's further away than he is when he throws the 1-2, and he'll catch him like it's 1 and a little step and then 2, and he catches him leaning back on their back foot with nowhere to go. Beautiful elbows on the ground to finish this one. Good for Calvin Kattar. Now, if you'd shown that a little bit earlier against Zabit, we'd be talking about very different stuff. But then the prelim card, I mean, wasn't amazing. I mean, Vicente Luque versus Nico Price was great because Vicente Luque takes punches and throws crisp counters off being hit in the face. He doesn't avoid punches, he just takes punches and throws back. And Nico Price will make a great fight with anyone. Vicente Luque, and this is why he was so dangerous for Wonderboy. Wonderboy was taking him apart, and then anytime Vicente Luque was like looking a little bit hurt or wobbled, Wonderboy couldn't really step in because anytime you step in for more than 1 punch, something's coming back from Vicente Luque. Vicente Luque throws a brilliant left hook on the counter of everything, and he throws a great cross counter with his right hand. But Vicente Luque managed to throw a left hook here while his head was being rolled back off a front kick to the chin. I was so impressed. Great fight. Price's face got fucked up badly. I mean, Price nearly darsed him in the was it the first or second? And that was the way that Luke caught him in the first fight, which is awesome. You know, tough on Nico Price because he had like an undefeated record and he's just taken some rough losses lately. But you know, these two could fight forever. And to be honest, with the state of the welterweight division and how hard it is to move up in it unless you've made yourself a meme, they could fight forever, with the occasional loss to Leon Edwards in between. The bad portion of the card was Carla Esparza versus Michelle Waterson, which was among the worst fights I've ever seen because Michelle Waterson is constantly billed as a striker, and then she spends the entire time shadowboxing from 6 feet away from her opponent, practicing social distancing in the middle of the cage, and then the commentators are talking about all the things she likes to do because she's not actually doing them to the person. You know, they're like, she likes to throw that left high kick, and you're like, well, she's never landed it, so why are you telling me about it? Just dreadful. And if you're getting caught with bum-rushing right hands by Carla Esparza, you aren't a top striker. You know, Michelle Waterson has always been a fun, arm-barring, takedowning person who has this karate lineage that they sell, but she never really lands any good strikes, except against that 50-year-old granny. So less said about that fight, the better. Glad she lost, because then I don't have to put up with being bored with her. Well, I mean, John Anik said right at the start, this could headline a Fight Night card, and I was like, oh, fuck, he's right. It really could. That would be, you know, if they start headlining cards with that sort of shit, and then they're like, why isn't the sport growing? You know, I won't know what to tell him. I'll charge him a consultancy fee and tell him that for millions of dollars. Alexei Oleinik versus Fabricio Verdum. Fucking hell. Fabricio Verdum enters the club of heavyweights who are just there to get their show money. Well, on the subject of that, Jeremy Stevens survived Fight Island, and all he got was 80% of his show money because he turned up 5 pounds overweight as well. But Oleinik versus Verdum, Oleinik throwing spazzy hands, Verdum not able to get him off with his usual return 1-2s. Some fun grappling from Verdum, but wasn't able to finish it. Lost the decision. You know, wasn't great. Wasn't what you'd hope from Fabricio Verdum, arguably best heavyweight ever or best heavyweight resume ever. And then Pettis versus Donald Cerrone looked like two dudes who were, you know, it looked like the reunion act of or a sequel to a film made far too late, you know. Bryce Mitchell versus Charles Rosa was fun enough. Some nice grappling in that one. Lots of three-quarter mount use and back takes and arm triangles, you know, open elbow stuff. We always love that. And Ryan Spann versus Sam Alvey. Sam Alvey loses his 4th on the trot, but he will be back. And the worst part is that he's getting paid like the least of anyone on the card. But he'll be back because they need people like him right now. You know, people who will just go, fuck it, I don't care, I'll fight anywhere. But, you know, Spann, in squaring up to throw 1-2s, he got caught by a couple of those right hooks, and you remember that that's the one thing Sam Alvey does, is the fact that dudes won't let him. That's meant that he's been boring in his last 8 or 9 or whatever it is. He was known as a knockout artist once. So not a bad night of fights. I think a pretty great... I mean, as far as returns from pandemic go, that's got to be pretty strong. You know, going to be hard to beat that. We've got 2 cards this week, so I'll just touch on the first one, and then I'll be back like Thursday to talk about what happened and the Friday one. Or is it Saturday, the next one? Whenever the Overeem Harris one's on. But this one is Smith versus Teixeira, and I've described these 2 cards as filler and killer, because this card is not great. Your headline is Anthony Smith versus Glover Teixeira, and honestly, the story with this is the same. You know, Anthony Smith's saying, I'm going to beat him, he's an old man, and I'm thinking, yeah, but Glover Teixeira just keeps turning up and showing us how bad the light heavyweight division is. But then that was Anthony Smith's job too, come up from middleweight, show us how bad the light heavyweight division is. You know, look out for the Glover Teixeira cross counter. He throws the right hand looping across the top of his opponent's left, or in answer to his opponent's right. You know, slips to his left, throws his right hand overhand. He occasionally throws a nice left hook, almost always after it. He very rarely throws his jab. And in recent years, he's mainly been taking a beating, bundling the guy to the floor, getting on top and elbowing him or arm triangling him. Then you just got like this shit show Frankenstein heavyweight bout between Ben Rothwell and Oven St. Preux. Someone asked me, what do I reckon of Oven St. Preux's decision to go to heavyweight? I said, you know, it's garbage, either light heavyweight or heavyweight. You might as well enjoy your food. You're going to get paid all the same. You know, Oven St. Preux is not going to be champion of anything. Well, maybe he will, but He shouldn't be. He shouldn't be because he's only got the Von Preux choke and hard kicks on the feet, but can't throw more than one strike at once or together, and has no gas tank. So, yeah. But I mean, on the one hand, this is garbage. On the other hand, you've got the go-go choke versus the Von Preux choke here. That could be awesome. Then I reckon the fun fights on this card, Marvin Vettori, he can fuck off for a start. He was moaning about how he's Italian for a start, so he knows people who've died during this thing, and then he's going on about how it's all overblown and we just need to get on with our lives. And then you're like, so we're supposed to believe that the science by the world is wrong and is actually all overblown, but we're also supposed to believe that you took tainted supplements by accident. There's an epidemic of supplement tainting, but coronavirus is actually just a bit of a hoax. I mean, he is spectacularly dumb, Marvin Vettori. He's always saying dumb things. But the fun ones here look like I can't believe I'm going to say a Ray Borg fight, but Ricky Simone versus Ray Borg could be fun because Simone stops a good takedown, and he fights very square, so he's always available for the overhand right. But if you watch like his fight against Hanayaya, really fun because he can fight square and then he throws right uppercuts and right straights and stuff like that. Does little pivots and things, but he's always square, so he's always ready to like double underhooks, double down block, drop his hips, stop the shot. Ray Borg, do you think Ray Borg's going to make weight during a pandemic? And this is bantamweight, so he's going to miss the weight class above what he tries to fight at. And then Alexander Hernandez versus Drew Dober, that's a fun one. Hernandez can be fun, bit of a dummy. Like if you watch him against Donald Cerrone, the one move you have to worry about with Donald Cerrone is the intercepting knee, and then he just runs onto it about 8 times and gasses himself out and then gets beaten up. Drew Dober, what a hottie. Just lost to Beneil Dariush a couple of fights back, but has been on a very good run. I mean, if you exclude the Beneil Dariush fight, KO'd Berkman and beat Frank Camacho up at welterweight, beat John Tuck by decision, and then most recently he knocked out Marco Polo Reyes and Nasrat Hakparast, I really loved his performance in that fight. He hit him with some really sweet counters, and Hakparast was a decent opponent. I think it would help Hernandez to get back to the stuff that he was showing in his fight against Beneil Dariush, using lots of movement. As much as he comes in on straight lines and got hit by counter knees by Donald Cerrone, I think that would probably work against Drew Dober. Lots of nice in and out movement, trying to stay out of the way of those powerful round kicks and the counter. What is he? Southpaw orthodox counter rear hand straight, whatever it is that he uses. And then on the undercard, you got Andrei Arlovsky versus Philip Lins, and Michael Johnson versus Thiago Moises. Tajara Eubanks, the Queen, versus Sarah Moras. Can I just point out that Valentina Shevchenko has still not fought Sajara Eubanks? And then fuck all else is going on. I mean, Brian Kelleher's on the card. He's all right. But, not an amazing night of fights, to be honest. Really, what's going to make it for me is that Drew Dober versus Alexander Hernandez and Ricky Simone versus, Simon, don't know. Is he a Carly Simone? Is he a Paul Simon? We don't know. Put him against Ray Borg, that could be decent. But anyway, I'm going to be back on Thursday to have a little catch up on those fights and then talk about the Overeem versus Harris card, which looks much better, if I'm honest. Let's keep hoping. Let's hope that no one dies from Jacare, and that we can keep doing this shit because it's good fun. And God, it's nice to have some stuff to talk about. I've also got a couple of Filthy Casuals quickies that I've edited together, and I can just put those out sort of whenever. I might put out one later in the week, or tomorrow, maybe tomorrow. And if you want to see my full thoughts on the Cejudo masterclass against Dom Cruz. Oh, we didn't even talk about Dom Cruz's excuse-making tour. He's now accusing Keith Peterson of being a drunk and stuff. And you're like, the stoppage was fine. I've seen guys... if you've watched any MMA, you've seen guys come back from worse because you've seen, like, Sakuraba get murdered by Smirnovas and the referee letting him just, like, get knocked out and then brought around with punches and then fighting back from there. You've seen Carwin versus Lesnar. You've seen things like that. But those are abhorrent. They're, like, the anomaly. You've also seen much quicker stoppages. I think that was a perfectly justified stoppage. But he's incredibly salty right now. He's doing the rounds and just telling everyone that Keith Peterson's always been a drunk. Even if he is, made the right decision, I feel like this is the reaction we all expected when he lost to Garbrandt. and he was very classy then, so he's doubling down now. But, got to keep yourself in the conversation because you want to come back straight into a title fight. It's like he kept saying that he'd been training 3 years for this fight. And you're like, so you planned to just sit out 3 years and jump in for a title fight. That was always the plan. Awesome. That's the worst thing about this sport. And then he's on about boxers get to choose their referees. And you're like, do you know what? Boxers have to fight their mandatory challengers. They tend to get stripped if they don't fight actual rated competition who've beaten people recently. But don't worry, we'll get him versus Faber 5 for the vacant titles soon enough, I imagine. Anyway, if you want to keep up with what I'm writing, head to thefightprimer.com. If you want to support the podcast, get access to additional Patreon pieces, and just have a damn good time, sign up to the Patreon. And if you want to send an email to the podcast, which I promise I will answer next episode, fightsgonebypodcast@gmail.com. I'm your boy, Jack Slack. This has been the Fights Are Back in Town podcast, and I will catch you in a couple of days, you cheeky fucker. Cheers. Michelle Waterson hugging everyone at the COVID fights, bless.